The air in the Sterling mansion wasn't just thick with the scent of lilies and grief, it was charged with the electric hum of ambition. At the center of it all stood Isabel Moreau, a vision in scarlet silk, a shocking choice for a wake. She wasn't the grieving widow. Not yet. But as she held court beside the grand portrait of the recently deceased Richard Sterling, she spoke in hushed, confident tones to anyone who would listen, ensuring they all knew her title was about to change. "He always said I was his future," she'd murmur, dabbing a perfectly dry eye. The wedding was next month. But as she was spinning her tale of destiny, the grand oak doors creaked open, revealing a ghost from the past nobody expected. And in her hand, she wasn't carrying flowers. She was carrying a leather folio containing the one thing that could turn a future bride into a footnote, the undeniable truth. The wake of Richard Sterling was exactly as he would have wanted it, an extravagant display of power disguised as mourning. Held in the cavernous marble atrium of his Long Island estate, it was a who's who of New York's financial elite. Men in bespoke suits spoke in hushed tones about market succession, while their wives, draped in subdued jewels, exchanged pleasantries that carried the sharp edge of gossip. Richard, a titan of the tech industry and founder of Sterling Innovations, had died suddenly at 58, and the vacuum he left was palpable. Presiding over this somber theater was Isabel Moreau. At 32, she was a masterpiece of curated perfection. Her scarlet dress, a bold Dior creation, clung to her like a second skin. It was a statement not of grief, but of ownership. For the past 3 years, she had been the beautiful, vivacious woman on Richard's arm, the one who had seemingly erased the memory of his first wife. "It's just devastating," Isabel said, her voice a practiced, breathy whisper to a sympathetic hedge fund manager. We were in the middle of planning the ceremony at Lake Como. Richard had already commissioned my gown. She would touch the enormous diamond on her left hand, a recent gift she referred to as her pre-engagement ring, a convoluted term that nonetheless served its purpose. Her performance was flawless. She moved through the crowd not as a guest, but as the lady of the manor, adjusting flower arrangements, offering quiet words to Richard's business partners, and directing the catering staff with a familiar authority. She was consolidating her position, making it clear to everyone that she was the inheritor of not just Richard's heart, but his world. Richard's sister Beatrice, a stern woman with a spine of steel and a deep-seated suspicion of her brother's romantic choices, watched from a distance. She saw through the charade. "Look at her," she muttered to her husband, "preening like a peacock at a funeral." Richard was a genius, but a fool for a pretty face. Isabel, catching Beatrice's glare, simply offered a small, triumphant smile. She had won. The aging, bitter sister-in-law, the whispering colleagues, none of them mattered. Richard had promised her everything. He had told her in no uncertain terms that his previous life was a closed chapter. His ex-wife Catherine was ancient history, a woman from a different era of his life, discarded and forgotten. Isabel had made sure to subtly leak to the gossip columns that the divorce had been brutal and that Richard had wanted nothing more to do with her. It was in the middle of one of her most poignant anecdotes, a story about a romantic trip to Paris, that the grand doors of the atrium opened, letting in the late afternoon light and a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The murmuring in the room died down, one conversation after another, sputtering out like dying candles. All eyes turned to the entrance. Standing there was a woman who was the antithesis of Isabel. Catherine Davenport was in her early 50s, though she carried her age with a quiet grace that made it irrelevant. She was dressed in a simple, perfectly tailored navy blue suit. Her honey-blonde hair was pulled back in a neat chignon, and her face, though etched with a genuine sadness, was composed. She held no purse, only a slim, dark brown leather folio clutched in her hand. She didn't look like a woman scorned. She looked like a woman with a purpose. Isabel's smile froze on her face. She had never met Catherine. But she had seen pictures. The woman who had been married to Richard for 25 years. The woman she had replaced. A wave of fury, hot and possessive, washed over her. "How dare she? Security!" Isabel hissed to a nearby guard. "Please show this woman out. She is not on the guest list. She's trespassing." The guard, a burly man named Frank, who had worked for Richard for a decade, hesitated. He remembered Mrs. Davenport. He remembered her kindness, the way she always knew his children's names. Catherine's eyes, a clear, intelligent blue, swept over the room, acknowledging no one until they landed on Isabel. She took a steady, deliberate step forward, her low heels clicking softly on the marble floor, the sound echoing in the sudden profound silence. "Isabel Moreau, I presume." Catherine's voice was calm, yet it carried across the entire atrium. It was a voice accustomed to being heard, not by shouting but by its sheer, unwavering command. "You have no right to be here." Isabel snapped, her composure cracking. She took a step towards Catherine, positioning herself defensively in front of Richard's portrait, as if claiming territory. "This is a private event, for Richard's loved ones. I am aware." Catherine replied, her expression unreadable. She stopped a few feet from Isabel, creating a tense standoff in the center of the room. "I was married to him for longer than you knew him. I think that qualifies me." "You were his past," Isabel spat, her voice rising. "A mistake he was happy to be rid of. He told me everything. He was going to marry me. This house, this company, this life, it was going to be mine. I am his future wife." The declaration hung in the air, a gauntlet thrown. The guests held their breath, a collective intake of air. This was the drama they had been whispering about. Catherine didn't flinch. Her gaze remained locked on Isabel's. A flicker of something petty perhaps crossed her face, before it settled back into a mask of stoic resolve. "The future," Catherine said softly, her voice now laced with an edge of cold steel, "is often built on the foundations of the past. And it seems there are a few things about Richard's past and his present that he neglected to tell you." She then lifted the leather folio. The simple, silent gesture felt more powerful than any shouted threat. "I'm not here to argue. I'm here to present a legal reality." Isabel stared at the leather folio as if it were a venomous snake. Her mind raced, trying to calculate this unexpected variable. What could it possibly be? Old divorce papers, a sentimental photograph, a desperate, pathetic attempt to reclaim a long-lost position. A legal reality. Isabel laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that echoed unnaturally in the silent room. "Let me guess. You've found some pre-divorce document you think is a loophole. Sweetheart Richard had the best lawyers in the country. Our divorce was ironclad. He made sure of that, so he could be free. For me." She gestured around the opulent room. "Look around you. This is my life now. Richard wanted me here. He did not want you here." She turned to the security guard, her voice hardening into a command. "Frank, I will not ask you again. Remove her." Frank took a half step forward, his expression torn. But before he could act, another voice cut through the tension. "That will not be necessary." A man in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair and a suit that was impeccably tailored, but comfortably worn, stepped out from the crowd. It was Alistair Finch, Richard Sterling's personal attorney for over 30 years. He had been a silent observer until now, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He walked slowly and stood beside Catherine, a quiet act of solidarity that sent a fresh wave of shock through the onlookers. "Alistair, what is the meaning of this?" Isabel demanded, her outrage now tinged with the first flicker of genuine fear. Alistair was supposed to be her ally. He was the one who would execute Richard's will, the will that she was certain would name her the primary beneficiary. "Moreau," Alistair said, his voice calm and authoritative, the tone of a man who had navigated countless boardroom battles and hostile takeovers. "Mrs. Davenport has every legal right to be here. In fact, she is here at my specific request, as per my client's final instructions." The phrase, "final instructions," landed like a physical blow. Isabel paled slightly beneath her perfect makeup. "Final instructions?" "His final instructions were to me, on the phone, just last week. He told me he loved me," she insisted, her voice growing shrill. Catherine remained silent, allowing Isabel's panic to fill the void. She knew that in a battle of wills, the person who maintained their composure held all the power. "Be that as it may," Alistair continued, his gaze unwavering. "Mr. Sterling's legally binding instructions, signed and notarized, take precedence over any verbal assurances he may have offered you." He gestured to the folio in Catherine's hand. "Mrs. Davenport isn't here to contest the divorce. That chapter is, as you said, closed. She is here as the legally appointed executor of Richard Sterling's entire estate." A collective gasp went through the room. Executor. The word was a cannon blast, shattering Isabel's carefully constructed reality. The executor wasn't just a beneficiary. The executor was the one in control. They were the steward, the decision-maker, the power broker. Isabel's face contorted with disbelief, then rage. "That's impossible. It's a lie. Richard would have made me his executor. He trusted me with everything. Did he?" Catherine asked, her voice soft but piercing. It was the first time she had shown a hint of emotion, a cool, cutting condescension. "Did he trust you with the company's Q3 projections? Did he discuss the vulnerabilities in the Phoenix Project source code with you? Did he tell you why he established a blind trust in 2022? Each question was a precise surgical strike exposing the superficial nature of Isabel's relationship with Richard. She had been his companion, his arm candy, a beautiful distraction. She had not been his partner. Isabel stammered, That's business. We didn't talk about work. Our relationship was above that." "Our marriage was built on it," Catherine stated simply, a fact no one could deny. She and Richard had started Sterling Innovations from the garage of their first home. Her name wasn't on the company letterhead, but her fingerprints were all over its DNA. With a quiet grace, Catherine unclasped the leather folio. She didn't produce a grand, sweeping last will and testament. Instead, she pulled out a single crisp document. She held it out for Alistair, who took it and turned to the assembled crowd. "This," Alistair announced, his voice booming with legal finality, "is the letters testamentary, issued by the Surrogates Court of the State of New York this very morning. It is a court order. It officially appoints Catherine Davenport as the sole and uncontested executor of the estate of Richard Sterling, granting her complete legal authority over all his assets, personal and professional, effective immediately." He then looked directly at Isabel, his eyes cold and unforgiving. "This includes this house. As of this moment, Ms. Moreau, you are a guest on a property administered by Mrs. Davenport. I suggest you moderate your tone accordingly." The world tilted on its axis for Isabel. The whispers in the room were no longer about her future wedding. They were about her stunning public humiliation. Her face, a mask of triumphant confidence only moments before, was now a canvas of pure shock and fury. She looked from the court document to Catherine's calm, composed face, and she finally understood. This wasn't a desperate plea from a forgotten ex-wife. This was a coup, a meticulously planned, perfectly executed takeover. "This is a trick," Isabel whispered, her voice trembling. "A forgery. You too. You conspired against him." Catherine simply slid the court document back into her folio. "The truth isn't a conspiracy, Isabel. It's just the truth. And it's something you never had." She took a step closer, lowering her voice, so only Isabel and those nearest could hear. "Richard and I spoke every week for the last 5 years. Did he ever mention that to you?" The question was the final devastating blow. It didn't just undermine Isabel's claim to Richard's future. It obliterated her understanding of his past. The foundation of her entire world crumbled to dust in that instant, leaving her standing in the rubble of her own ambition, a queen in a scarlet dress with no kingdom to rule. To understand the document in Catherine's hand, you had to understand the 25 years of marriage that preceded it. Richard and Catherine hadn't just been husband and wife. They had been architects of a shared dream. They met in college, he, a brilliant, restless coder with an almost manic energy, and she, a sharp, pragmatic business student who saw the genius beneath his chaotic exterior. Sterling Innovations wasn't born in a sterile Silicon Valley incubator. It was born over late-night pizza and lukewarm coffee in their tiny, cramped apartment, with Catherine writing the business plan on a legal pad, while Richard furiously typed code on a clunky prototype computer he'd built himself. She was the one who secured their first angel investor, who managed the books, who hired their first employees. He was the visionary, the engine. She was the chassis, the steering, the thing that kept the whole enterprise on the road. For 2 decades, they were an unstoppable force. They sacrificed everything, vacations, hobbies, and eventually any semblance of a life outside the company. The company's success was monumental, but it came at a cost. The bigger the empire grew, the more it consumed Richard. The passionate young coder became a demanding CEO, and the strategic partner at his side slowly became an accessory to his legacy. Their conversation shifted from shared dreams to his quarterly reports. He was no longer building it with her. He was presenting his achievements to her. The distance grew into a chasm. The silence in their massive, empty mansion became louder than any argument. There was no single dramatic betrayal. It was a slow erosion of intimacy, a death by 1,000 corporate obligations. The divorce, when it came 5 years ago, was shockingly civil. The world, fed by gossip columns, expected a bloodbath over the billion-dollar fortune. Instead, they settled it quietly, privately, with Alistair Finch as the sole mediator. Catherine didn't fight for half the company. She didn't want it. She had been drowning in Sterling Innovations for years and craved air. She took a generous but by billionaire standards modest settlement, the smaller house on the coast where they'd spent their early, happier summers, and a portfolio of investments that would ensure she never had to worry about money again. She wanted out. She wanted a life of her own. She went back to school, got a degree in landscape architecture, and started a small but successful business designing restorative gardens for hospitals and therapy centers. She was building things that grew, that healed. What the world never knew, what Isabel could never have imagined, was that the divorce was not an ending. It was a transformation. About 6 months after the papers were signed, Richard called her. It was late, and his voice sounded hollow, lost. He was in a hotel in Tokyo, having just closed a massive deal, and he confessed something startling. He had never felt more alone. He had celebrated with his team, toasted with his new partners, and then returned to a sterile, empty suite with no one to truly share it with. He missed her, not as a wife, he admitted, but as his grounding force, his confidant, his only real friend. That call started a new secret chapter in their relationship. They began to talk first once a month, then every week. They never met in public. Sometimes it was a phone call. Other times he would drive to a discreet cafe in a town an hour away from her coastal home, and they would sit in a quiet booth for hours talking. Freed from the obligations of marriage and the crushing weight of the company they had built together, they rediscovered the friendship that had been their foundation. He confessed his fears about the company's direction, the sycophants who surrounded him, the hollowness of his new glitzy life. He told her about Isabel. "She's fun cat. She makes me feel young. But it's like watching a movie. It's entertaining, but you know it isn't real." Catherine, in turn, told him about her gardens, about the quiet satisfaction of creating spaces of peace. She became his confessor, his advisor, the one person who would give him the unvarnished truth. He wasn't CEO Richard Sterling to her anymore. He was just Rich, the brilliant, insecure man she had known for 30 years. She warned him about certain board members she never trusted. She gave him advice on a hostile takeover bid, drawing on her deep institutional knowledge of the company. She was his secret weapon, his ghost consultant. He, in turn, anonymously funded a new wing for a children's hospital for which she was designing the therapeutic garden. Theirs became a partnership, purified, stripped of all the messy, complicated layers of romance and expectation. It was a bond of pure platonic love and deep, abiding respect. It was during one of these secret meetings about a year ago that Richard had looked at her across a worn wooden table, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, and said something that chilled her. "If something happens to me, Cat, they'll tear it all apart. All the vultures, the ones on the board, the competitors, even Isabel. She doesn't understand what it's for. She just sees the glitter. She'd sell it for parts to fund a lifetime of shopping." "Don't be so morbid, Rich," she had replied lightly, but his expression was deadly serious. "I'm not," he said, his voice low. "I'm being a strategist. You were always the best strategist. I need a plan, a fail-safe. I need someone to protect our legacy, the good parts of it." He reached across the table and touched her hand. "There's no one else I trust." The diagnosis came 8 months before his death. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctors the best money could buy were sober and clinical. They spoke of treatments, of managing symptoms, of quality of life. But Richard heard only the ticking of a clock. They gave him a year, maybe 18 months if he was lucky. He got less than 9. The first person he called wasn't Isabel. It was Catherine. He didn't call her from his penthouse or his gleaming office at Sterling Tower. He called from a payphone, a relic from a bygone era, on a rainy street corner in Queens after leaving the oncology center. He wanted the call to be untraceable, a ghost on the wire. "Cat," he said, his voice raspy, broken. "I need you." She heard the raw fear beneath the words, the terror of a man who had controlled every aspect of his life, suddenly facing the one variable he could not command. She dropped everything, cancelled a client meeting, and drove for 2 hours to the discreet cafe where they always met. He looked smaller, diminished. The legendary charisma that captivated boardrooms and charmed beautiful women was gone, replaced by a stark human vulnerability. He told her everything: the diagnosis, the prognosis, the suffocating fear. Isabel, he explained, knew nothing. "How can I tell her?" he asked, his voice thick with a strange mixture of guilt and resignation. "Her entire world is built on the idea of our grand future. A sick man doesn't fit into that picture. She'd try to be supportive, I guess, but it would be a performance, all for show. I can't bear that." He was right. Isabel thrived on vitality, on power, on the reflected glory of his success. She was a partner for a victory lap, not for a long, painful decline. For the next 2 hours, they didn't talk about medicine. They talked about legacy. Richard, the master strategist, was now planning his final campaign. "They're circling," he said, referring to a faction on his board, led by a ruthless venture capitalist named Robert Coleman. "Coleman wants to break up the company, sell off the R&D division, outsource everything, and turn it into a soulless cash cow. He sees it as a collection of assets. You and I, we saw it as an engine for innovation." He saw Isabel in her own way as an equal threat. "She's been pressuring me to create a massive trust for her to give her shares a seat on the board. She thinks it's her right. If I die and she gets control of a significant block of shares, Coleman will manipulate her in a heartbeat. She'll be his puppet. He'll flatter her, charm her, and she'll hand him the keys to the kingdom without even realizing it." That was when he laid out his plan. A plan so audacious, so contrary to every public perception that it was utterly brilliant. "I need you to be my executor, Catherine," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Legally, officially. The person with the final say. We need to go to Alistair. Tomorrow." Catherine was stunned. "Rich, I can't. I have my own life now. I left that world behind." "And that's precisely why it has to be you," he insisted, leaning forward, his eyes burning with a desperate intensity. "You're the only one who isn't compromised. You don't want the money. You don't want the power. You're the only one who will protect the idea of it, the part that was ours." Over the next few months, they engaged in a clandestine series of maneuvers. They met with Alistair Finch in secret, using his old, dusty law library that hadn't seen a client in years. Richard, a man who lived in the digital world, insisted on a campaign of analog secrecy. No emails, no text messages, just face-to-face meetings and burner phones. Alistair, fiercely loyal to the man he'd known since he was a brash upstart, worked tirelessly. He drew up a new will, one that was airtight and irrevocable. It was a masterpiece of legal fortification, designed to withstand the inevitable challenges from Isabel and the board. They established a series of nested trusts and holding companies moving assets in a way that would be almost impossible to untangle without the executor's key. It was a corporate fortress, and Catherine was being handed the only set of keys. During this time, Richard continued to play his part in public. He took Isabel to galas, bought her the ridiculously large diamond, and let her plan their fantasy wedding in Italy. It was a smokescreen, a grand deception to keep her and everyone else looking in the wrong direction, while he quietly transferred his entire kingdom into the hands of his ex-wife. "It's cruel in a way," Catherine had said to him one evening, a wave of guilt washing over her. "She's living in a fantasy you're actively encouraging." Richard had looked out the window, his expression pained. "The cruelest thing I could do is let her and men, like Coleman, destroy something that was meant to build the future, not just fund their lavish lifestyles. This is a necessary cruelty, a corporate amputation to save the body. You're the only one I trust with the scalpel." Their last meeting was 2 weeks before he died in the same cafe. He was visibly weaker, the illness carving away at him. He slid the slim leather folio across the table to her. It contained copies of everything. The new will, the trust documents, the court-ready petition for executorship, and a sealed handwritten letter. "Don't open that until after." He'd said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It's a road map. My final thoughts." He looked at her, his eyes filled with 30 years of shared history. "Thank you, Kat. For everything. For building it with me. And for being there to save it at the end." He died in his sleep, a sudden decline the doctors hadn't predicted, but weren't surprised by. Isabel was the one who found him, her screams echoing through the pristine, silent mansion. She immediately began playing the part of the grieving fiancé, completely unaware that the real power had already changed hands, waiting for the right moment to make its move. The official reading of the will was scheduled for the day after the wake, a brisk Tuesday morning. The venue was the main conference room at the law offices of Finch, Covington and Dunn, a space of dark mahogany, supple leather, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. The mood was thick with tension and anticipation. Isabel arrived first, flanked by a pugnacious high-priced lawyer named Stephen Keller, who specialized in contentious estate battles. She was dressed in severe black, her face a mask of somber indignation. She had spent the last 24 hours in a fury making frantic calls, convinced that the document Catherine had produced was some kind of legal trickery that could be easily undone. Keller had assured her that an executor appointment could be challenged, especially if undue influence could be proven. Richard's sister Beatrice was there looking grim and skeptical of everyone. A few senior board members, including the formidable Robert Coleman, were also present, their faces impassive, but their eyes sharp with calculation. They were there to understand the new landscape of power. Catherine arrived last, precisely on time. She was alone. She wore a simple, charcoal grey dress and carried the same leather folio. She nodded politely to Beatrice, ignored Isabel completely, and took a seat opposite her, with the long, polished table between them like a battlefield. Alistair Finch entered, carrying a thick, leather-bound document. He sat at the head of the table, adjusted his glasses, and cleared his throat. "We are gathered for the reading of the last will and testament of Richard James Sterling, dated the 15th of February of this year." He began, his voice formal and steady. "This document revokes all previous wills and codicils." Isabel shot a triumphant look at her lawyer. Richard had made a will 2 years prior, one she had helped him with that had been very generous to her. A new will made recently could only be better. He must have updated it to include their marriage plans. Alistair began with the standard bequests, a generous donation to his alma mater, sentimental items left to his sister Beatrice, substantial bonuses for a few long-serving employees, including his driver and his head of security, Frank. Each name read was a drumbeat steadily building the tension. Then he paused, looking directly at Isabel. "To Miss Isabel Moreau," he read, his voice devoid of emotion, "with whom I have shared companionship for the past 3 years. I bequeath the contents of the Park Avenue penthouse, including all furniture, art, and personal effects currently within it. I also bequeath the sum of $5 million to be placed in a trust managed by my executor, payable in annual installments over a period of 10 years. Silence. $5 million was a fortune to most, but to a woman who expected a significant fraction of a multi-billion-dollar estate, it was a profound public insult. The 10-year payout was an even bigger slap in the face, a controlled allowance, not an inheritance, and the penthouse. He had given her the contents, not the property itself. That's absurd, Isabel's lawyer, Keller, interjected. We have reason to believe Mr. Sterling's intentions were far more substantial. He and my client were engaged to be married. Alistair Finch slowly looked up from the document, his eyes cold as ice. Mr. Keller, if you would allow me to continue reading. The will addresses that specific point. He cleared his throat again. It is my express wish, he read, quoting directly from Richard's will, to make it clear that while Ms. Moreau was a cherished companion, we were not engaged and had no formal plans to marry. The diamond ring I presented to her was a gift and a gift only, and should not be misconstrued as a promise of matrimony or any future legal claim on my estate. Isabel's face went from pale to ashen. It was a direct repudiation, a posthumous denial of the very identity she had built for herself. The future wife was, in the eyes of the law and the final words of her lover, nothing more than a well-compensated girlfriend. "This is ridiculous," she hissed, her voice shaking with rage. "He was sick. That woman," she pointed a trembling finger at Catherine, "she took advantage of him. She poisoned his mind. If you persist with these baseless accusations, Ms. Moreau, I will have you removed." Alistair warned, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. He returned to the will. "Now regarding the remainder of my estate," he continued, "which includes all personal properties, liquid assets, and my entire controlling interest in Sterling Innovations." This was it, the main event. Every person in the room leaned forward. Robert Coleman's eyes narrowed, trying to game out the possibilities. Alistair took a deep breath. "I bequeath in its entirety to the sole executor of my estate, my trusted partner and dearest friend, my ex-wife, Catherine Davenport." The words detonated in the silent room. Beatrice Sterling gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Robert Coleman's jaw physically dropped, his mask of corporate composure shattering. Isabel just stared, her mind unable to process the sheer scale of her defeat. It wasn't just that she had been sidelined. She had been erased. A footnote in a story where Catherine was the entire book. Furthermore, Alistair continued, driving the point home like a nail in a coffin, "I hereby appoint Catherine Davenport as the new chairman of the board of Sterling Innovations, effective immediately, as is my right as the majority shareholder. It is my final and most fervent wish that the board support her in the vision we once shared for this company, a vision of innovation, integrity, and long-term growth, not short-term profit and dismantlement." He looked directly at Robert Coleman, whose face had turned a mottled shade of red. Richard had seen the coup coming and had launched a preemptive strike from beyond the grave. The will was a masterpiece. It didn't just transfer wealth, it transferred absolute power. Catherine now controlled the company, the board, the family fortune, everything. Isabel finally broke. A strangled, guttural sound of pure rage and despair escaped her lips. "No!" she shrieked, jumping to her feet. "I will not accept this. This is a fraud. I will contest this. I will drag her and you and this entire company through the mud for years. You will not get away with this." Catherine, who had remained silent and impassive through the entire reading, finally looked at Isabel. Her expression wasn't triumphant or smug. It was one of profound weariness, almost sadness. "You can certainly try, Isabel," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But Richard and Alistair have spent the better part of a year making sure you would fail. Every I is dotted, every T is crossed. While you were picking out wedding venues, we were building a fortress. This is over." With that, Catherine stood up. She nodded to Alistair, gave a brief, almost imperceptible glance of acknowledgement to Beatrice, and walked out of the room, leaving behind the wreckage of shattered ambitions and the deafening silence of absolute victory. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Isabel, true to her word, launched a furious legal assault. Her lawyer, Stephen Keller, filed a motion to contest the will, citing undue influence and diminished capacity. The story was leaked to the press, and for a few weeks the New York tabloids feasted on the salacious headlines, "Billionaire's ex-wife in shocking estate grab," and "Jilted lover vows war over sterling fortune." Isabel gave tearful, indignant interviews, painting Catherine as a manipulative predator who had swooped in when Richard was at his most vulnerable. She portrayed herself as the tragic, devoted fiancée robbed of her rightful future. But the fortress Richard and Alistair had built held firm. At the preliminary hearing, Alistair presented an avalanche of evidence. There were sworn affidavits from Richard's doctors, confirming he was of sound mind until the very end. There were detailed psychological evaluations Richard had willingly undergone. Most damningly, there was a video deposition Richard had recorded with Alistair 3 weeks before his death. In the video, Richard looked tired, but was lucid and articulate. He calmly and methodically explained his reasoning. He spoke of his deep, abiding friendship with Catherine, their shared history with the company, and his fears for its future. "Catherine Davenport is the only person I trust to safeguard my life's work," he said, looking directly into the camera. "My relationship with Isabel Moreau was one of affection but not of partnership. This will, in its every detail, represents my clear, final, and unequivocal wishes." The judge threw out Isabel's case before it could even go to a full trial, ruling it frivolous and without merit. The defeat was total and humiliating. Isabel's legal bills were astronomical, and her public image was shattered. She was no longer the tragic fiancée. She was the greedy, grasping mistress who had been publicly put in her place. She faded from the society pages, eventually selling the contents of the penthouse, which Catherine, as executor, had allowed her to keep, and disappearing to Europe, a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. The battle at Sterling Innovations was quieter, but no less brutal. Robert Coleman and his faction on the board initially tried to block Catherine's chairmanship. They called an emergency meeting, planning to hold a vote of no confidence. They had severely underestimated her. Catherine didn't come into the boardroom with bravado. She came with data. She had spent the weeks following the will reading in a deep dive, using her old, intimate knowledge of the company and the secret roadmap letter Richard had left her. The letter wasn't a sentimental farewell. It was a brilliant, multi-page strategic document. It detailed the corporate rot Richard had been unable to excise, pointed out the specific executives who were loyal only to Coleman, and outlined a revolutionary new direction for the company, a return to the risk-taking, long-term innovation that had made them great. In that first board meeting, Catherine systematically dismantled Coleman's arguments. She exposed the flaws in his strip-and-sell strategy, presenting projections that showed how it would gut the company's future for a short-term stock bump. She then presented Richard's, and now her vision. It was bold, it was ambitious, and it was compelling. She didn't win over Coleman, but she won over the undecided board members, the ones who had respected Richard's genius and were wary of Coleman's vulture capitalism. She secured her position, not just by legal right, but by sheer competence. Coleman, outmaneuvered and politically isolated, resigned from the board a month later. One evening, about 2 months after the will reading, Catherine was working late in Richard's old office, now her office. It was a vast, impersonal space she hadn't yet changed. As she was going through a file cabinet, she found a small, locked box. She recognized it. It was from their early years together. She found the key in the back of a drawer and opened it. It wasn't filled with stock certificates or legal documents. It was filled with memories. A photograph of the two of them impossibly young standing in front of the garage where it all began. The napkin on which he had first sketched the company logo. A dried flower from a corsage he'd given her at a long-forgotten college dance. At the bottom was the original handwritten business plan she had written on a yellow legal pad all those years ago. Tucked inside it was a single sheet of paper, a recent addition in Richard's familiar spidery handwriting. It wasn't part of the will or the formal letters. It was a personal note. "Cat," it began. "If you're reading this, it means our plan worked. I'm sorry for the mess. I'm sorry for the public fight I've put you through. But I knew you were the only one strong enough to handle it. The money, the company, that's not the real inheritance. That's just the burden. The real inheritance is this." He had drawn an arrow pointing to the old business plan. "A second chance. A chance for you to finish what we started. To make it what it was always supposed to be. Not just successful, but good. Don't do it for me. Do it for the two kids in that garage who believed they could change the world. I never stopped believing in you. Your friend always. Rich." Tears streamed down Catherine's face for the first time since his death. She wasn't crying from grief or stress, but from a profound, bittersweet sense of closure. The inheritance wasn't about the money or the power. It was about a promise. It was the final silent conversation in a 30-year history, a story of love loss and an unbreakable partnership that had transcended marriage divorce and even death itself. 6 months can feel like a lifetime or the blink of an eye. For Sterling Innovations, it was an era of renaissance. The name Catherine Davenport, once a whispered footnote in the company's history, was now etched into its very soul. The turbulent aftermath of the will reading had faded, replaced by the steady rhythmic hum of a machine being meticulously rebuilt and refined. The revolution had been quiet, but its effects were seismic. The initial changes were swift and symbolic, designed to send an unmistakable message. In her first week as chairman, Catherine convened an emergency board meeting. She didn't come with fiery speeches, but with a simple 2-page agenda. The first item was the immediate liquidation of what she termed vanity assets. The Gulfstream G650, the penthouse on Park Avenue, the company's box suite at the stadium, and the yacht currently docked in Monaco are non-essential. She stated, her voice calm and even cutting through the tense silence of the boardroom. They are relics of an era that prioritized the appearance of success over the engine of it. An old guard board member, a holdover from Coleman's faction named Harrison Kane, cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Catherine, those are company assets. Selling them now, particularly the jet, might signal instability to the market. It's a sign of weakness." Catherine met his gaze without blinking. Instability. Harrison is having a balance sheet weighed down by symbols of executive isolation, while our top engineering talent is being poached by competitors because our hardware is 5 years out of date. Strength is reallocating capital from a $30 million flying lounge to the people who will design our next billion-dollar patent. We are a technology company, not a luxury lifestyle brand. The market will understand. She didn't wait for a vote. She directed the motion. The assets were sold within a month. The resulting capital, a sum exceeding $50 million, was not absorbed into general revenue. Instead, Catherine announced the creation of the Sterling Genesis Grant, an internal venture fund dedicated to financing high-risk, high-reward projects proposed by the company's own employees. It was a direct investment in ingenuity, a tangible reward for the very innovation the company was founded upon. The message to the staff was electrifying. Your ideas are our most valuable asset. This new philosophy was most evident in Catherine herself. She abandoned Richard's 50th floor office, a vast, silent space of dark wood and intimidating art that she privately called the Mausoleum. It felt less like a workspace and more like a monument to a man who had become disconnected from his own creation. She relocated her entire executive team to the 32nd floor, taking over a glass-walled office nestled directly within the sprawling R&D division. Her workspace was a nerve center, not a throne room with whiteboards covered in flowcharts and a door that was perpetually open. She became a familiar presence in the labs and on the coding floors. She didn't do formal staged tours. She just walked often with a coffee mug in hand, observing, listening, and asking questions. One afternoon, an older hardware engineer named Miles Callahan, a man with thinning hair and kind eyes who had been with the company for 28 years, stopped her in a corridor. "It's good to see you down here again, Mrs. Davenport," he said, a genuine smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "It feels a bit like the old days, the garage days." "Please, Miles, it's Catherine," she replied warmly. "And I hope it feels better than the garage days. At least the coffee is." He chuckled. "The coffee's better, but the energy, it's the same. We feel it again. The belief that we're building something that matters." It was during one of these quiet afternoons that her assistant buzzed to announce an unexpected visitor. It was Beatrice Sterling. Catherine was surprised, since the will reading their interactions had been polite but brief and formal. Beatrice entered the bustling office space, looking slightly out of place in her perfectly coiffed Upper East Side attire, amidst the casual dress and creative chaos of the engineers. She paused, taking in the scene outside Catherine's glass walls. "It's certainly loud in here," Beatrice observed, though her tone wasn't critical. It was one of genuine surprise. Richard's office was always so quiet. You could hear a pin drop. "I prefer the noise," Catherine said, gesturing for Beatrice to sit. "It's the sound of work being done." Beatrice sat, her posture stiff, her purse clutched in her lap. For a moment she seemed to be searching for words. "I came to apologize, Catherine," she said, finally, her voice lower now, more personal. "Properly. For years I misjudged you completely. I saw you through Richard's lens after the divorce, a closed chapter, a part of his past he needed to move on from. When you appeared at the wake, my first thought was that you were a vulture, coming to pick at the bones for a bigger share." She looked down at her hands, then met Catherine's eyes. Her own gaze filled with a raw honesty. "It took me months to understand." Richard didn't lose his mind in his final days. He found it again. He remembered who he was at the very beginning, and he remembered that you were there with him. He wasn't leaving you a fortune as a payout. He was entrusting you with his very soul. The best part of it, anyway. He knew you were the only one who wouldn't just count the money, but would understand its purpose. With that, Beatrice reached into her purse and placed a small, simple wooden frame on Catherine's desk. It held the photograph from the lockbox, a faded, sun-bleached picture of two people in their early 20s, impossibly young, standing proudly in front of a cluttered garage. "I was helping clear out his study at the house," Beatrice explained. "I found this in his private desk drawer, separate from everything else. I realized it didn't belong with his things. It belongs here, with you." Catherine picked up the frame, her fingers tracing the worn wood. She looked at the faces of the young man and woman, staring back at her. Their expressions a potent mixture of naivete, exhaustion, and unwavering belief. It felt like a lifetime ago. A different world, a different her. The weight of the journey from that dusty garage to this glass office settled upon her not as a burden, but as a map of a life lived. After Beatrice left, Catherine sat in the silence of her office for a long time, the sounds of innovation swirling just outside her door. She thought of the gardens. She used to design ecosystems that required careful planning, the pruning of dead wood and the nurturing of new growth to create something beautiful, balanced, and sustainable. She realized with a sudden profound clarity that she hadn't changed professions at all. She was still a landscape architect. Her soil was now corporate culture. Her seeds were ideas, and her sunlight was the brilliant minds of her employees. She was tending to the most complex garden of her life. She was rooting out the weeds of greed, pruning the branches of excess, and cultivating an environment where the best ideas could break through the surface and flourish. The inheritance was no longer a weight. It was a tool. It was a purpose. She stood and walked to the edge of her desk, placing the small framed photo where she could see it every day. It wasn't a relic of a past she had lost. It was a compass for the future. She was now building the architect of a new and lasting foundation. And so Catherine Davenport's story isn't just about a dramatic will reading or a mistress put in her place. It's a powerful testament to the fact that the loudest person in the room isn't always the one with the most power. It's about the silent bonds that run deeper than public romance, and the difference between owning someone's affection and truly sharing their legacy. Isabel craved the glitter, the title, the victory. But Catherine understood the foundation, the work, the soul of it all. In the end, Richard didn't leave his empire to his lover. He left it to his partner, proving that some connections are unbreakable. What do you think? Was Richard's final act a brilliant piece of strategic planning to save his company? Or was it the ultimate act of cold revenge against a woman he deceived? Was Catherine right to step back into the world that had cost her so much? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of quiet strength and shocking twists resonated with you, please give this video a like, share it with someone who loves a story of true justice, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that will leave you speechless. Thank you for listening.